So my topic this evening, ironically, I'm opening with a picture of chess as well. And in fact, I've got quite a few pictures of chess throughout, but I'm not talking about chess specifically, you'll be pleased to know. So it's not a chess only conversation. I want to talk about competitive advantage, and I've subtitled it, Beware of Uncritical Strategic Metaphors Bearing Gifts. And that's my topic this evening. Very quick slide about who I am. I hate these slides, so I've just portrayed myself as a pawn here. That was my aim with this slide. I'm researching narratives in organisational agility at Christ Church Business School, and I'm currently teaching undergraduate project management by the means of giving them projects to do, which is going fantastically, but it's reading week, so I don't care. Why did I research competitive advantage if I'm looking into organisational narratives about agility? So what I'm kind of interested in is, how do we link agile to mainstream management theory and teaching? Because there's a fair amount in technology management, but agile is very much going mainstream, but I haven't seen any literature coming into the mainstream. It's not in the strategy articles or anything else. So I'm trying to cross that bridge, and it was suggested to me by my supervisor. And for those of you who haven't studied at a high level, being suggested by your supervisor means it's 100% mandatory that you do it, but in a very gentle, sort of nice way, that I research a topic called dynamic capabilities and try to work out what they're trying to do at their core. And so I ended up writing about competitive advantage, which is because that's what they do. So how did I do it? Basically, I kind of cheated. There were two papers, one which did a review of competitive advantage, and one from a really noted strategic author was a working paper on what competitive advantage was, and they, between them, identified 28 key papers, and so I stole their papers and used it for my own analysis. And I analysed 5 aspects. So I looked at conception, sustainability, preconditions, effects, and attentions. I'm not going to really touch on the last 4 this evening. Feel free to ask me about them later. But I am going to talk about sustainability, about conceptions of agility, and there's a little bit about sustainability. So how do people think about competitive advantage? The first one I've called the market conceptualization. And that's very much your basic economics. We have got a competitive advantage if we are producing the cheapest product on the market, or we're producing a more expensive product that's got some great features in it that people want. That's competitive advantage. And that's been around since Adam Smith wrote in 1770s. So, you know, this is a long-standing theory, and it's probably the one that most people think about. Day and Wensley say that people are exhorted to come up with ways of delivering lowest cost or superior customer value, which is management speak for feature punching it up. Then there's the market-related conceptualization, and that's actually where people are positioning competitive advantage in relation to the position that the firm takes in the market, i.e., have they got the majority of the market share? Are they stopping other people from entering the same sector of the market? So there's lots of ways of preventing entry into the same sector of the market. The classic one is intellectual property. So if you think about Apple, for example, they have got lots of patents, and what they're doing there is they're protecting their ability to hold a corner of the market. And of course, it should be pointed out that monopoly is by far the most efficient way of creating a competitive advantage, i.e., if you have no competitors, you definitely have an advantage. There's cumulative advantage, and that's where, or aggregate advantage, and that's where you're building advantages together. So it's not just one advantage, i.e. you have one product, it's you have lots of advantages which build up to give you a good advantage. And then finally, there's relative advantage. And that is acknowledging and perhaps stressing that any advantage you have is relative to someone else. So I'm going to go into a little bit of theory for a couple of slides. Hopefully this won't get too long, and then we'll get some really juicy stuff. So resource-based view is probably the most important theory taught in business schools. And as Penrose put it in 1959, the firm is a collection of resources which are then manipulated to achieve certain goals and perhaps reorganized. Barney says, what are the resources? Well, it's all assets, capabilities. It's all of the things that go into a firm. So that includes people, that includes the raw materials that you've got access to. It includes the intellectual property that you've got hold of. It includes your organizational culture, all things which are absolutely key to being an effective organization. And Barney goes on to say that there are 4 or 5, depending on when you read what he wrote, characteristics which are important to recognize when a resource is important to the firm. And it uses the VRIN, VRIN, or VRIO, VRIO acronym. And it's, is the resource valuable, i.e. does it add value to what you're doing as an organization? Is it inimitable, i.e. sorry, is it rare, i.e. is it not something that everybody's got access to? Is it inimitable, i.e. can other people not copy it? Like, the harder it is for people to copy what you're doing, i.e. have access to your resource, the more valuable that resource is. And there's 2 here, non-substitutable or organized to capture value. Non-substitutable, I think, is related to inimitable, but it's basically, could you swap it out with something else and get just as good a product? And organized to capture value, quick story about that. EMI, the big music firm that everybody's heard of, invented the CT scanner. But the problem was they were not positioned to capture the medical devices market at all. And they exited the market after less than 6 years. GE and Siemens, however, were able to license the product and then were able to capitalize on that. And of course, it done very, very well out of it over the years. So it doesn't matter how valuable, rare, inimitable, non-substitutable your resources are, you know, the design for a CT scanner, if you can't then capture the value, for example, if you don't have the infrastructure to do it. So the view under the resource-based view of competitive advantage is not only can 2 competitors not exploit the same market niche, which is sort of the same as you will never get 2 species in the same ecological niche in an environment. But for it to be sustainable, your competitive advantage has to be no potential competitors can possibly exploit it either, i.e. there's got to be barriers in place to stop it. And if it's inimitable, it's perfect competition. The problem with perfect competition is everybody's on a level playing field, everybody can copy everybody else, and you'll never get any massive profits out of it. And Barney, again, this is exactly what he said. And he says it's sustainable when firms are unable to duplicate the benefits of the strategy. Dynamic capabilities built on the resource-based view. And effectively what it says is resource-based view is absolutely fine, but it sort of takes a snapshot in time. What it doesn't allow for is the fact that the environment is going to change around the firm. So what happens in hyper-competitive environments? So this theory came out in the 1990s. So this is emerging around the same time that you're starting to see the web bubble expanding. And so they were really concerned about hyper-competitive environments where you've got lots of things being innovated and destroyed and innovated and destroyed in a constant cycle. And they were really interested in how do we understand what competitive advantage is in this context. And they identified over a number of years 3 core capabilities that an organization needs in order to be able to adapt to a changing environment. The first is the ability to sense and shape opportunities and threats. That is, if you think about classic SWOT analysis, can you identify opportunities and threats? Can you also create new opportunities? So for example, Apple creating the iTunes store was an example of them creating a new opportunity. Can you seize opportunities? So it's well and good having a team that are out there scanning the horizon, but can you then convert that into something that you can integrate into your products, into your lines, into your organization? So you need to be able to seize them. And then you need to think about, what do we need to do as a firm in order to adapt to this change shape? And so this is about modifying your strengths and weaknesses as a firm in order to be able to exploit the opportunities and threats. So it's nice to bring it back to a SWOT analysis. And Teese, one of the original authors about dynamic capabilities, said, well, you've got to keep the enterprise's unique asset base going. And my point here is that this sounds like Agile. So in Agile, effectively what you have are, at a low level in an organization, you should have teams that are sensing and shaping, seizing and reconfiguring. And that's why Agile teams can be, you can have two models. You can have one where you've got very stable teams over a long period of time, in which you probably don't need to adapt rapidly, because that implies that you've got quite a strong environment, quite a stable environment. But if you need to reconfigure regularly, then you've probably got teams that are dissolving and reforming and dissolving and reforming to adapt to the challenges that they're coming up against. And so their idea of what sustainable competitive advantage is its barriers to duplication, but also, can you adapt to the changing context? And you need to constantly renew your capabilities as an organization to prevent erosion. And that's the focus again on aggregate rather than singular. So I came to the end of this analysis and I wrote about 8,000 words of really fascinating prose. And I then I said, hold on a second. We keep talking about this competitive advantage, but that means there's a game. And so what game are they actually playing? And this this took me back to the classic Carsey's 1986 book, Finite and Infinite Games, which is on camera if you have a look. And so for those of you who haven't come across Cars before, he talks about, he starts by saying there are at least two types of game. One could be called finite, the other infinite. A finite game is played for the purpose of winning, and an infinite game for the purposes of continuing the play. And so the characteristics, these are very high level. He goes into much more detail in his book, which is quite accessible, by the way, for a philosophy book. He says, the game is played to win in a finite game. There are agreed external immutable boundaries. So time, we're going to play this game for 90 minutes. I think that's a football game or something. Space, we've got boundaries around the pitch, and there are players, and there are very clear rules about how it's played. The players are clearly identified, to the point where if somebody who is not a player goes onto the pitch, that causes problems. The winner gets a title and power. Okay, in football, perhaps the title and power is not that important, but if you think about some of the games that have been played across Europe over the last 1,000 years, clearly some people get a lot of title and power out of winning games. Losers might well get a rank. So if you think about the Olympic Games, you get the gold medalists, but you also get the silver and bronze medalists, and then the people who came after them. And very often there's no point in playing unless you win. Infinite games, on the other hand, are about continuing play. One of the things that people play with are the boundaries. So you play with the boundaries of time, the space, and the players that are involved. And in fact, they can join and leave at any time. There's no way to win, but equally there's no way to lose, except when game stops play. And you're playing for the joy of playing. So when I went back and looked at all 28 of those papers again, I found that all of the language they were talking about and using was about finite games. So it was all about winning and losing, or winning and ranking. And it was all relative to other players, i.e. they'd drawn geospatial and participant boundaries around what they were doing. But there were no agreed external boundaries. So very often those boundaries were internal to the firms, i.e., oh, this quarter we did better than Microsoft. Okay, what if Microsoft disagree with you and are using different metrics? What does that mean? Sinek, in his book The Infinite Game, yes, which is worth reading, he says the game of business is the very definition of an infinite game. And the point he's making is, actually, we keep talking about finite games, but we really should be talking about infinite games. But if you don't have that agreed external time box, how do you know who's won? How do winners gain a title and power? For example, BA were very, very proud of advertising that they were Europe's favourite airline. But actually, when you did an analysis, it turned out they weren't the most popular airline. They were just the one that people used the most. And Virgin complained to the Advertising Standards Authority about that. And they won because it turns out you can declare yourself a winner provided you draw the lines sufficiently well that nobody can challenge them. And what do players play? Why do players play if not to win the game? Like, if you've won this quarter, does that mean the game's over? Oh, we can fold the business up now, put it back in the box. Oh, but we want another game, and we want another game. So surely there's something about perpetuation here. And there's some real implications for this. Do firms carry competitive advantage from one game to the next? Can they do that if the game doesn't exist? What about if they're only competing with themselves, i.e., we want to beat this quarter's sales next quarter? How do they avoid losing against themselves if that's the only thing that matters? And I've got the Mockingjay up on the screen, which many of you will know from the Hunger Games. And Carr stresses literally in section 2 of his book, whoever must play cannot play. And there's a couple of really important things to note there. First of all, if your competitor doesn't know that you're competing against them, or knows that you're a competitor but doesn't agree with the way you're playing, i.e. they don't care about your quarters, for example, then they're not playing the same competition that you're playing. You really need to think, am I really playing against these people? Alternatively, if your business model forces people to play your game, Facebook, then the people who are forced into playing the game aren't playing. They're dependent on you for their livelihoods. Now, a couple of points there. First of all, Carr explicitly links that to what happened in Germany in the 1940s. The Jews, the queer people, Roma, political opponents were forced to play a game which by definition they could not win. And as a second point, generally speaking, monopolies are not a good thing. And monopolies are where you can effectively force people to play your game rather than playing a wider game. I'm aware of time. Don't have a go at me, Vlad. This is the cut down version. So I have kind of 2 more slides anyway. So first of all, I want to remind you not to think of an elephant. Lakoff points out that if you say, and he does this to his classes, he says, if you say don't think of an elephant, immediately this is what people start thinking about. They can't help it. This is a natural response. And he calls that the reflexivity of the constructive world, which is to say, if I am talking using words, then those words are the things that are being constructed in your brain. And that's the only way we've got of communicating. So talking about competitive advantages cues connotations in your mind about games, whether or not they're intended. You should be thinking, what effect does that have on your teams? So I have a few suggestions, but I'm sure people can come up with more. Focus on the why of what you do, not the how are we going to win this week. Talk about continuing and connecting. Those networks, creating networks, which is sort of illustrated by this really nice sort of rhizomatic picture in pink, are more effective at continuing the game. There's nothing wrong with having finite games. I mean, inter-team competitions are good. Sales is inherently a competitive environment, but actually keep that in perspective. Sustainability is more important than short-term achievements. Think about using open source and open innovation. That's a real game changer, because if you are part of the ecosystem, then you're not something in an ecological niche. And finally, be ethical and avoid forcing people to play to avoid accusations of problems. That's what I've got. I've got one final slide to leave you with as a thinker, and I'm done.